It's etched in your mind. You can't forget the horror.
It's a loud bang. Looked out of the window, you can see all flames coming out of the engine.
People were falling on top of each other. I thought, I'm going to die here.
One moment people taking off, looking forward to their holiday. Within seconds, this terrible accident.
Thick black smoke, 2 or 3 gulps of that and you would be helpless, unconscious.
As soon as that smoke reached people's faces, they couldn't see.
Hysterical, screaming, crying, fighting to find the families.
Kind of guilt. Why did I survive and others didn't?
It was only minutes that we were on board that plane, but a lot happened in that time.
I think the number that had been saved really is a tribute to the way the emergency unit swung into action.
It was horrific inside. It's something that's never left me.
I said, how bad is it? Doug said dozens have probably died.
The investigators will be looking at how it was possible for such a vicious fire to develop as quickly as it did.
Every single aspect of this accident will be thoroughly investigated. It has to be, because we're deeply concerned about aircraft safety.
There were recommendations that still haven't been implemented.
Once we found out they knew there was a fault with the engine, we were incensed because there was a needless loss of life. The plane should never have flown.
If there'd have been smoke hoods that day, a lot of people would have survived.
He banged the table a couple of times to say, we need to bring these in. These will save lives.
The lessons have not been fully learned.
That was a disaster. Of 55 people that died that day, should never have happened.
It was a very early start. We were going to be flying at just after 6. We lived about 35-40 minutes away from the airport. My grandfather came to collect us, got to the airport, dropped us off, and then we checked in.
We were up at a ridiculous hour, knowing it was going to take us an hour and a half to get there and an hour to check in. And as ever, a few minutes late setting off, which concerned me, so therefore I thought we're going to have to drive that bit quicker. And of course at that time in the morning, hardly any traffic, but going from here in Sheffield to Manchester, and suddenly came up behind a lorry. I had to overtake him, so I pulled out, and suddenly headlights appeared in the distance. And all I could do was to pull the car in between the front and the rear wheels. As we passed each other, our respective wing mirrors clashed. And then before you knew it, this car that we'd crashed with suddenly appeared in our rear mirror. Lo and behold, it was a police car. He forgave me and off we went. It's a pity we didn't have a proper crash and that we weren't able to make it to the airport.
We were due to get a lift to the airport. We couldn't wake him. We were on time, but we couldn't wake him. Eventually got him out of bed and we would be probably half an hour, 3/4 of an hour late to check in. That meant that Lindsay smoked and she wanted a smoking seat. So we got the next available, which I think that played into our luck on the day that we were nearer to the front than we would have been had we been on time.
My name's Sylvia Chappell and I was the survivor of the Manchester air disaster. I can remember that day so clear. I'd worked the night before and then got up early in the morning to go to the airport. And just excitement really to go away and have a break because we worked hard. So it was just something to, to look forward to.
They asked her where she'd like to be seated. And she said, oh, one of the back 2 rows, which at that time always meant that that's where people could smoke. Of course, she looked at me because she thought that I didn't know she was already smoking. And so I gave her a glance and said, as if I didn't know. And that was it. They were the last words. She went down to get on the plane, and that was the last I saw of her.
I remember being in the departure lounge. It was the old Manchester airport in those days. It was a big chandeliers. And we went to the left-hand side of the departure lounge and waited for the aircraft to be called. And the flight came up and we boarded just after 6 and got on board the aircraft, sat in our seats, and our seats were row 13.
So my seat number was 14B. Lindsay's was the window, which was 14A. Chap comes in, he sits next to me, so that would be 14C, and then we're given safety instructions. But there was that kind of holiday atmosphere. Corfu, August. I was paying attention to the safety instructions, but I'm not sure everyone was. There was a bit of a kind of buzz about the place at the time.
Got on the plane, sat down. It was my friend to the right of me. A young man was sat next to me on the left, and we were at the back of the plane. And I had a big ghetto blaster, so we were listening to the music. And I was playing Annie Lennox, one of my favourite singers. There Must Be an Angel. And I played it quite loud, actually, because the person sat next to us quite enjoyed the music. I had a strange feeling that I didn't want to fly that day. And I just said that, I just feel a bit strange. I don't know whether I want to go, and my friend just said to me, we'll be fine, don't worry.
There was this atmosphere of joy, really, on the plane. People looking forward to their holidays.
Everyone was happy, people were laughing and joking, everyone was really looking forward to going away.
So there was my mum, she sat by the window, then I sat in the middle, then Simon sat just by the aisle, and then over the aisle, that's where Dad sat. I remember my mum saying when the engine started to just start up, I remember her saying, oh, that's loud. I just remember kind of dismissing it, really. But not dismissing it so much that I don't remember it. So you always wonder, were there early signs that there was something wrong?
So this was an early morning flight, and before the aircraft departed there would be the usual engineering checks to make sure that the aircraft is ready to go. There would be a walk-around check by one of the flight crew to see if there's any observable issues with the aircraft. And then on board, the flight crew would work through their checklists. The cabin crew would prepare the cabin, they'd make sure everybody is on board and seated, and they would have done the mandatory safety briefing. But of course no one would know that this was going to be anything other than an ordinary flight.
My name's Roger Shepherd. I was a firefighter at Manchester Airport. I was 38 years old at the time. It was a nice August morning. All the doors were open. And about 6:30 in the morning, we got a call from air traffic control to go out and check the airfield for birds. Luckily, there were very few birds about, and we got back into the station, pulled up into the bay, and just as we got out of the machine, we heard the aircraft going down the runway, and we heard a loud whoomp. We looked over and we could see the aircraft going down the runway with a huge ball of smoke and flames behind it.
Almost immediately, there was a flickering inside the cabin.
We assumed it was a tyre bursting. Lindsay immediately said, I think we need to move. The wing is on fire. And she felt the heat because we were actually on the wing.
We started to slow down, and lots of calls for stay calm, stay in your seats. But by now, we must be only, 5 seconds from that thud. People started certainly to be aware that we had a problem.
Initially, it wasn't obvious what the bang was. That could have been a tyre burst. If you brake too hard with a tyre burst on an aircraft like that, it's only got 6 tyres, the risk is that you burst the other tyres as well. And then very quickly they got a call from air traffic control to say that there was a fire, and there was a lot of fire. Now back in the passenger cabin, it was much more obvious as to what was happening. It got very hot very quickly, and actually it started to generate smoke within the cabin, and you can only imagine the fear and the anxiety that must have brought to everybody on the aircraft.
It just looked as if there was a hose pipe coming through the plane, and all this black smoke was coming through from the left-hand side, and people were screaming, and the plane wing was burning. You could see the plane on fire. I thought, I'm going to die here.
Lindsay reacted quickly because she knew or saw how bad it was, but the plane had started to slow. It had aborted the takeoff, but once I got into the aisle behind people, we were shuffling forward in the aisle, but we weren't getting off the plane, and that's what I couldn't figure out.
I remember Mum saying, get up. Dad was saying, kind of, look, sit down, and she said, no, we're going. She forced us up. My God, she assessed the situation pretty quickly. She was in no doubt she wasn't being on that aircraft, and she was in no doubt that her two sons were not going to be on that aircraft either.
The plane had turned off the runway, which was procedure at the time. And as it turned off the runway, it was hit by a wind. As a result of that, the fire was engulfing the plane even faster.
We were still going down that runway, and people started to get out of their seats. Felt like ages. Just, in the aisle, just waiting. There was a problem opening the doors at the front of the aircraft. A delay meant that you started to see the smoke start rolling over the top of the aircraft ceiling. And it was this thick, black, kind of acrid smoke that just rolled and sank.
The smoke was terrible, and there was like little flames in it as well. It was like flickers of light in it, and then people panicking.
It was only minutes that we were on board that plane, but a lot happened in that time. The smoke came into my face, thick black smoke, 2 or 3 gulps of that, and you would be helpless, unconscious.
I was suffocating. I'd inhaled twice. There's no way I could have inhaled a third. I couldn't take my breath a third time because there's no way I would have got out of that plane. I was dying.
That is the machine that I was on that day, called an RIV, Rapid Intervention Vehicle. We were there within 2 minutes of the aircraft turning off, and we foam on, started tackling the fire. At this time, we didn't know that the fire had got into the fuselage. We were working on the fire, and we saw the tail of the aircraft slowly start to sink. And we realised then that the aluminium had given way with the excessive heat, and that the fire would be inside. Unfortunately, with an internal fire, you can't go in and start fighting the fire until everybody that's going to escape and get out has escaped. Then and only then can we go in.
Because of where the fire was, the back of the aircraft became impossible to escape from very, very quickly. And the overwing exits were not initially able to be used, partly because people struggled to open them. So the focus was really on the 2 doors at the front of the aircraft. And the first door actually jammed as it was being opened, so it was an unimaginable scene.
People were falling on top of each other, hysterical, screaming, crying, fighting to find the families.
There was a desperate need to leave the aircraft. And the only 2 exits were, 10 rows away? I mean, we're still a long way from the exit, and this smoke is kind of going past you.
The main steward at the front of the plane was trying to get us out of the front of the plane, but the chute snagged. So he tried to look back and open the door on the left at the front, and then went back to open the door on the right, and that's the door that most people use.
The over wing, the person adjacent to the window having to not only undo it and let it fall on you when it weighs 30 kilograms, and you've got to lift it out, and instead of throwing it out, you bring it inside, falls on your lap, and then somebody's got to lift it off you and move it somewhere else. And sadly, this is when you start to get then just a congestion of people fighting to get out. And this is where it's terrible, with people losing their children because they got pulled apart. Horrendous what it must have been like.
There's a bulkhead at the front, and so you have a corridor to walk through, and there are 2 exits, but only one person can get through at a time. So it's effectively like having one exit, and plus one exit wasn't available, we didn't think, because that was the side that was on fire.
You couldn't go down the aisle, so I had to go over the seats. There was no other way. There's too many people. So I went over diagonally over the seats, which didn't go down properly. I pushed my friend first because I think the mother instinct came in, and I just pushed her over, well, threw her over the seats. I just ran up the wing, and a fireman shouted me to jump, so I jumped.
I took a gulp, felt woozy, and the stewardess at the front of the plane, I can still see her, holding a handkerchief over her mouth, said, "Breathe under the fumes." So I bent down, breathed on the fumes, and then saw the light at the front of the plane and made my escape.
I got to the door, Simon exited, and Joanna Toff, who was the stewardess, her words were, "Just jump." So he jumped down the chute. As I got to the bottom of the chute, I stood up and then was pretty much instantaneously taken to the ground. I got out at the time that the big fire tenders immersed the aircraft and passengers in foam, but it knocked me off my legs and I went back underneath the aircraft. And then was, pulled out.
I thought, I'm not leaving my girls. I fought to get out of that plane to make sure that I was not leaving my children. And the strange thing was, there was a picture of my daughters that I took away with me, and that was the only thing that survived the plane. None of my clothes, nothing. My watch and the picture. That's all that survived.
I remember just praying that Dad would get off. And then I heard Simon shout out, "He's here." And the relief was enormous. But you just remember seeing people in the same situation, looking for people that hadn't come out.
Sarah was at the back of the aircraft. She was there already keyed up to be stood at the back ready to evacuate down the chute at the back. But when the pilot turned the aircraft around at 90 degrees, the flames went underneath the aircraft and immediately lit the chute, which burst into flames immediately. And Sarah, with others, was stood at the top of the chute ready to jump off. End of. We lost her within seconds thereafter.
To see people fighting for their life, it's just an awful thing to see. I just said bye to him, and he said bye to me, and I said, "Don't go down the aisle." He did, though.
The actual fire went out fairly quickly, but the challenging part then was seeing the people getting out, going inside, finding people that hadn't made it, people that you couldn't really recognise as people at the back of the aircraft. You've got to remember that we were there trained for it, we had equipment, we had protection from our fire gear, but the people sat in that aircraft, they were going away in the summer clothes. It was horrific inside. It's something that's never left me. I went round one side to the rear exit and I found the body of one of the stewardesses there who had actually opened the door, but I'm afraid she'd passed away in the doorway. But she was doing her job, you know, and she died doing her job. Went round the other side, the aircraft, and one of the front exits, the stewardess there, Joanne, she was there getting people out. She was doing her job brilliantly, and then the smoke got to her and she collapsed down in the doorway. Luckily, I could reach up, just grab her hand, pull her down the chute. The moment she was in fresh air, she was back to her normal self again. But she was a very brave woman, very brave.
The cabin crew were just, incredible. Arthur had to contend with a door that was jammed. The emergency chute had opened early on the door and jammed the door. What went through his mind, knowing that he had to evacuate that aircraft, seeing probably what he saw. And Joanna was to stand there and not leave your post and help people get off. They saw the full horror of what was unfolding. Absolutely saved lives.
We were all confused and dazed on that runway. Lindsay found me, we had a hug, and we were just very relieved. And we sat watching people coming onto the coach that were blackened faces. That's all I can remember.
Just saw this aircraft in flames with this smoke that just, it just filled the sky. We were one of only a few families that got off in its entirety. Dad was pretty sick. You could see that when he got off the aircraft because he was coughing and he was bringing up this, what you could probably only describe as tar. And I think I'd obviously gone into kind of shock. Both Dad and me went in the first ambulance to Wythenshawe Hospital.
I had multiple injuries to my skeleton because I jumped off the wing. I think it was about 30 foot off the ground. I had heels on and it jarred all my skeleton. I just think it's so sad that so many people, happy people at the time, lost their lives like that. It was awful.
I'm Rob McLaughlin. I was a reporter in August 1985 for Granada Television. I remember it well. I remember the news desk ringing me to say there had been a crash of some sort. I was the first reporter on site, and when I arrived at the airport, the first thing that struck me was silence. I walked into the terminal and it was crowded, but it was completely silent. And at that point, the head of Greater Manchester Fire Services press office, Doug Galvin, came alongside, and I said to him, "How bad is it?" And Doug said to me, "Dozens have probably died."
I think the number that have been saved really is a tribute to the way the emergency unit swung into action in terms of putting out the flames to the best of their ability.
I rang my news desk and they then went into emergency mode. They had to clear the schedule. Other reporters were called in. Tony Wilson, known nationally because of his work with the Hacienda Club and music, was then brought in to act as the anchor in the main studio. And we then set about trying to get as much information because we were dealing with a horrific situation.
In a matter of just seconds, flight KT328 had turned into an horrific inferno, which denied passengers in the rear section a chance
Live
to
from the
escape.
scene of the crash.
It is Manchester's worst ever air disaster and the world's
My closest friend at that stage lived in Macclesfield, and his wife, Pauline. And suddenly the phone went and said, "Have you turned on the television yet?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, turn it on immediately." He said, "Because there's been an accident at Manchester Airport." Turned it on and saw the picture of the plane already in flames. Richard then went round every hospital in the area to find out whether Sarah had been placed in one of them, but in the end didn't find one. And that's when he had to phone us and tell us that it looked like that we may have lost her.
When his brother rang and said Dave was on the plane, even at that moment, I sort of knew he was dead, really. I can honestly say it was probably the worst moment of my life, and it was like being torn in two. To this day, I've never suffered pain like that, and it was physical as well as sort of an emotional pain in the sense of huge, huge loss, and also realising that it had been in horrible circumstances as well, that there'd been a huge fire. John and his wife went round all the hospitals that were receiving people from the accident. After a couple of hours, John rang me and said Dave wasn't in any of the hospitals and it didn't look good, and could I bring his dad to the airport.
We came back to the fire station and we just sat there in silence, and you realise that people were going to be dead or injured, traumatised. There was a numbness about it. You'd gone out, you'd done your job. And when I got home, I had two lads, two young boys. When I got in and saw them, that's when I did my crying. I just burst into tears. Our chief then, he came in and he said, if you want to cry, if anybody don't want to come in that night, if you want to take leave or anything, that can all be arranged. And I've got to say, that night, not one man took any leave. Everybody that was on the job the night before came in and did another night shift.
When we got to the airport, it's a horrendous smell of aviation fuel. Where we parked, you could see the plane. We were met by someone from British Airways or Airtours who basically said Dave was missing, presumed dead, and could someone identify the body? And that was sort of done in one sentence. This room, there were people collapsed, there were people who were hysterical, huge distress, uncontrolled grief through the whole room, and the thing really was out of control.
You're numb. We're just numb. I mean, we fell asleep on the floor. Of course, there were tears galore. We had to wait until I think it was the Tuesday before we found out. So that was 4 days of waiting and going through hell to find out. My daughter had only got one possession that had survived, and it was a camera. Everything else she'd got hadn't survived. So it was quite obvious that she'd been in a bad spot.
For the first time, a full view of the port side of the aircraft and the shredded remains of the rear fuselage. It was on this side of the plane that the engine blew up. So it was to hear that the Prime Minister was immediately taken on her arrival at the airport.
Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher flew up via helicopter to the airport. She surveyed the wreckage and then spoke to reporters. And I think Margaret Thatcher summed up very well what must have been going through the passenger's mind before the plane took off. They were about to go to Corfu, they were about to go on holiday, the excitement in the air, the joy in the air, and then suddenly turned into complete disaster. Not in minutes, a complete disaster in seconds.
Can you give us your reaction on what you've seen?
Well, everyone is appalled by the tragedy, as you would expect. A holiday aircraft, one moment people taking off, looking forward to their holiday, within seconds, this terrible accident. Every single aspect of this accident will be thoroughly investigated. It has to be, obviously, because we're deeply concerned about aircraft safety.
Tonight, the plane was carefully moved by crane off the runway.
The aircraft had been taken across to the old British Airways hangar. In one half was the aircraft, and on the other half of the hangar I'm afraid with all the bodies of the poor passengers in white sheets on stretchers, stretching out right round the hangar floor. There was just a huge dividing curtain between them.
This was a very delicate process. The bodies, the remains had to be brought in because relatives would have to identify whichever way possible. And I was asked by a fire officer who I knew, did I want to go into the hangar? And I didn't want to go into the hangar really, but I went in very briefly and I was just left with an overriding sense of horror.
For some, there were tearful reunions as relatives and friends arrived at the hospital. Some sat dazed, unable to talk, but others described the horrors of this morning.
It's a loud bang. Thought a tyre had gone, and the pilots, immediately put the brakes on straight away, really stamped the brakes on. Looked out of the window, you can see all flames coming out of the engine.
He was just about to take off, I think, and there was a bang that come from the left-hand wing. And we looked round through the windows and you could see flames and smoke and all this coming from the engines. And the plane stopped and the cabin started filling up with a bit of smoke. And by this time, they'd opened the doors, dropped the chute down, and we'd got out then.
Dad stayed in hospital. He was there for some time. He had to go into intensive care and high dependency unit. And he was there with probably half a dozen others because of the smoke inhalation that they'd taken.
At nearby Wythenshawe Hospital, there were cheers from a crowd who gathered at the main entrance as the Prince and Princess talked to nurses who treated the injured.
Both Prince of Wales, as he was then, and Princess Diana came to see us and to see the survivors in hospital. I remember Prince Charles just looking at me and saying, "Look after your dad." So yeah, that was a boost. It was well received.
They wanted to meet the fire crew, so we positioned the appliances on the apron. She came down and said hello to everybody, and she was quite interested in what had gone on, and she wanted to know, was it hard seeing the people in the aircraft and everything. We just said, yeah, it was a bit grim, like, but yes, she was very pleasant.
Lots of theories were beginning to develop quite early on. A problem with the plane the night before, that there was a problem with the plane coming off the runway because it hit a wind. And the Sunday Mirror newspaper had obtained a copy of the log of the 737, and we asked them whether they would let us have a look at the log. The plane log was indicating that there had been a problem before the plane took off that morning, and they agreed before they took off that they would begin to monitor that problem. There had been warnings, issues with these combustor cans on these particular engines. We began to sense that this information may not have been conveyed to the pilots. And so therefore, when they saw the problem in the log, they didn't understand perhaps the seriousness of what that combustor can problem was. That plane should not have taken off that morning, under any circumstance.
Once we found out that they knew there was a fault with the engine, we were incensed because there was a needless loss of life. The plane should never have flown.
How could this disaster befall such an inherently safe aeroplane? A complete answer must await the examination now being carried out by the government's Accidents Investigation Branch.
The fire originated because a combustor can in the engine of the left-hand side of the aircraft failed and it exploded catastrophically. It actually managed to break through the protective casing that's built into an engine that should have stopped that piece of shrapnel from firing where it did. And actually, through a terrible coincidence, the shrapnel that made it out hit a fuel inspection cover underneath the wing, and that cover was less strong than the rest of the wing and actually led to fuel pouring out of the wing of the aircraft.
It was obvious fairly soon after the accident that there were specific reasons why the accident had happened. You've got a situation where the combustion chamber of the aircraft had been welded and that had split. It turns out that the inside of the plane is massively flammable. It then turns out that people's exit is prevented because the front bulkhead is far too narrow.
The inquest here at Manchester Town Hall is only one of several steps on the road to telling the public the full story of last year's disaster. But what this inquest has done is to pull together all the strands of what went wrong and give a chance of assessing whether the lessons from Manchester have been learnt.
It was held in Manchester Town Hall. I gave evidence. We had representatives, barristers, lawyers and passengers, survivors giving evidence.
Captain Peter Terrington and his co-pilot Brian Love agreed the plane might have been stopped more quickly, but the cockpit dials didn't indicate a fire, they couldn't visually see anything, and they assumed initially it was a minor problem. Captain Terrington said he was later totally horrified by what he saw when he left the aircraft.
The coroner concluded that most people died from suffocation. Asphyxiation and suffocation was the cause of death for most of the deceased.
As in many such accidents, it wasn't the main fire so much as the subsidiary fire in the cabin and above all the smoke and panic that killed at Manchester.
A lot of those victims never got out of their seats. Toxic products that was in the seating, that was in other areas of the carriage of the plane, had elements of cyanide and other toxic elements in it.
Smoke, darkness and panic combined to cause the disorientation and confusion which cost many lives. Lights along the aisle floor like these and brighter exit lights could well guide survivors towards exits. Equally, the question of making seat covers more resistant to flames. Materials are available and in service, which when compared with traditional materials are less inflammable.
The Air Accident Investigation Branch report made 31 recommendations, which is a high number of recommendations, and they've had a profoundly positive impact on the industry. And several of those recommendations related to research that needed to be done to make a cabin more survivable, to help us better manage the passengers and their evacuation from the cabin. So people were paid a small amount of money to participate in evacuation trials, and a smaller group were given a bonus if they were the first off the aircraft. And what we saw time and again with trials is how people would compete and become jammed in exits, and that influenced both design within the cabin, but also the instructions we give people, and the very clear instructions that cabin crew will give in an emergency to help people find the safest exit.
If this disaster brings new lessons in the field of safety, then it will be another example of the paradox of good coming out of a great tragedy.
Manchester was an absolute turning point in how certainly UK aviation changed. But it didn't change because the industry wanted it to change. It changed because SkySafe, the Air Investigation Branch, put pressure on the CAA, British Airways, other airlines to force them to implement the recommendations, and they didn't implement all of them.
It all started when we met at the inquest, and when it came to the conclusion, the AIB had thought that smoke hoods ought to be introduced. We agreed, but nothing happened. And it was at that I got on the telephone to John Beardmore, and we said, we've got to get a group together. This is when we realised that we got a fight on our hands.
We called ourselves SkySafe, and we researched and tried to get people to listen to us, the authorities to listen to us.
Our primary aim was to really understand what had happened at Manchester, and we took the fight to the CAA and other authorities.
Air Accident Investigation Branch had the whole aircraft sent down to them at Farnborough and have it reconstructed. We were invited down to see the aircraft itself, and to actually go onto the aircraft was mind-boggling, in the sense that there were parts of it, particularly at the front of course, that were intact, even to the degree that they'd got their cassettes still in the back of the seat chairs and so on. But at the back, it's all disintegrated. What immediately struck you as you walked in, the aisle was so narrow and the gap between seats was so narrow, we stood there just staring at it. How in heaven's name would you expect to get out of there without crushing each other?
You assume that there are enough exits that everybody can get out safely within a reasonable amount of time. But at Manchester it wasn't like that. For a 13-year-old, the seat, I mean, my knees were at the back of the seat in front of me. There was just no room. It was just cram as many people on that aircraft as you could.
Today's report, 3.5 years later, sets out the reasons why.
Just how quickly these recommendations will be implemented remains to be seen.
It's a very detailed report. We welcome what's in here. I think our only reservation is, will the CAA introduce these recommendations?
The Air Accident Investigation Branch report made 31 recommendations, which is a high number of recommendations, and they've had a profoundly positive impact on the industry. Much of that is probably invisible to the passenger, but the space around the exit rows is bigger. It makes it easier for people to get out of an overwing exit. The space around the galley area near the main doors is also designed in such a way to make sure that there's a flow through of people. But also the lighting along the floor, the markings around the exits are all some of the changes that have happened, as well as changes to cabin crew training. So very many positive things came out of a very tragic event.
The big one that they recommended was smoke hoods.
But would smoke hoods similar to this one have allowed passengers to breathe for vital extra minutes in the dense fumes?
If there'd have been smoke hoods that day, a lot of people would have survived that.
Smoke hoods were available to members of the cabin crew, but they weren't available to the passengers. And to this day, 40 years on, that has not happened in the United Kingdom.
I simply pull the whole mask over my head, and I'm now protected.
Families fought long and hard for smoke hoods and other safety measures, because it may have avoided, or may avoid in the future, the kind of tragedy that their families went through.
They really pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed and made a nuisance of themselves to make air travel safer for the rest of us.
In Manchester today, SkySafe, a pressure group formed by survivors and relatives of the accident victims, announced their dissatisfaction with the report. They claim smoke hoods available today could have saved those who died.
There was no protection for us. This wasn't available to us, and we believe it should have been.
After the Manchester disaster, experts set out to establish that smoke hoods did work and would not impede an emergency escape.
800 people from the northeast volunteered to take part in Operation Exit at Teesside Airport. Using harmless imitation smoke, passengers were told to put on their smoke hoods and leave the plane. It tested evacuation from several emergency situations, as well as 5 different smoke hoods. The results will be considered by the Civil Aviation Authority, the American FAA, as well as the Ministry of Defence and the RAF.
We did see examples of these lightweight smoke hoods. Representatives of the Area Investigation Branch, of whom Eddie Trimble was a big part, and he really campaigned on the day for the use of smoke hoods. He said, I've lived with this report for years, and I think he banged the table a couple of times to say, we need to do something about this. We need to bring these in. These will save lives.
We gave a presentation in Parliament, and it included Linda doing all the drawings by hand because no computers then. It went down a bomb. It was fantastic. We thought we were certain to get approval, which they did. And we found out, and we were joyous that it got through the committee. And then we sat back and waited then for when the committee then submitted to government the government have to come back and confirm whether they accept it or not. Well, because of the Civil Aviation Authority, they vetoed it. And that was the biggest gut wrench, because we'd got everybody else supporting us.
A smoke hood in the Manchester fire may have made a difference for some, but the other side of the argument was that actually a smoke hood would take time to get out of the packet, to figure out how to put on, and actually on balance, the regulators felt that the time lost for evacuation was worse than the time that might have been gained by having that smoke hood. The balance for the regulator is to look at, by making a change, am I introducing a new risk, or is there a better way to spend what's always a limited amount of money that might be available for safety improvements on other things? And in the Manchester fire, the focus was very much on improving survivability by making it much more rapid for people to get off the aircraft. So the changes they made around lighting, around spaces, around briefings and so on were seen to have a much greater effect than the thought of putting smoke hoods onto aircraft.
The argument they put forward is they don't want to be able to put the smoke hood on top of the life jacket, because the life jacket should take the preference of place. Well, if you look at the statistics, hardly anybody's ever had to use a life jacket. And yet when we start talking in terms of smoke, it's saved extensively.
When you go on a plane, the stewardesses, all the staff on the plane have a smoke hood. If they can have a smoke hood, the passengers should have a smoke hood. It's as simple as that.
I carry a smoke hood. I carry 4, I carry 1 for every member of my family. I suspect a lot of people do who work in the industry as well. This is a smoke hood with a charcoal filter. It's a pretty lightweight smoke hood. It's got a rubberized base. And so what you do is you put your hands in, pull it over your head, and then it goes tighter to form a sealer. And then the second type is more like a kind of respirator, like a snorkel. You put it in and then you put 2 clips over your nose, and then there's a filter. I do think that, you know, they should be freely available on an aircraft in the same way that a life jacket is. You know, it takes up so little space.
The man next to me didn't survive. We talk about survivor's guilt. Why didn't I do anything? Why couldn't I have done anything on the day? It's such a regret of mine that I didn't nudge him or say, come on.
Kind of guilt. Why, you know, why did I survive and others didn't? At 13, it's a pretty tough question to get your head around. It's pretty hard, 40 years on. It changed my life, it changed my outlook on life. How do you reconcile that you survived and others didn't? The surviving bit is kind of, yeah, it's getting out. But you have to kind of survive post-Manchester. You have to ensure that what you do in life honours the people that have died.
I suffer with post-traumatic stress, and people think that, you know, because you look okay and you can function and laugh and joke about things, that you're okay, but you're not. It's all in your mind, and I've not slept one full night in 40 years.
It didn't really affect me until about 7 years afterwards, and I was sort of reliving it. It was very depressing, and I thought, I can't deal with this. I'd need help. It was understanding why you felt like you did, why you felt that had you done a good job, did everything work, could I have done it any different? And you've got to answer that question. No, I couldn't have done anything different than I did that day.
Some of the things that I'd seen and heard about had traumatised me so badly. I couldn't talk to any of my friends because I didn't want to pass that damage, that trauma on to them. After the accident, I probably went to the airport every day for the first year, because that was the only place where I thought I could go, that I could be close to him again. Weeks later, unbelievably, British Airways made a room available on Deansgate, and there was a room full of the contents of the aircraft. People's clothes, shoes, children's toys. I mean, it was horrific. And the room stank of smoke. And somehow that you're expected just to go and collect the things that you thought were yours. There was just no need for that ever to happen, really. It was just so badly done. No one was looked after psychologically, emotionally during this disaster, which led to many, many people's lives being blighted. You've got to work out and learn from those disasters how things can be different for the future.
We train every day for these scenarios should they arise. Base Manfire 2 is mobile, so if we got called to an incident of that nature, we're ready to deal with any incident should it arise. Roger, probably taking you back with some old memories. This is my vehicle for the days. Obviously it's changed from what we saw back in the day.
Changed dramatically, yeah.
We've got the HREP, thermal imaging cameras that we've got, tri-media hose and everything, you know. What was it like back yours?
They were good, they served the purpose, and at the time they were the state of the art that they'd bought for covering 747s.
Yeah. The technology-wise, the fire appliances that we've got now, we've got far superior media than what we had back then in the day. I don't think there's a day or a week that I've been here at Manchester Airport where it's never ever mentioned. We're always learning from that. We'll always revert back to the disaster to see if, you know, the different training outcomes, can we do anything different? And we've adopted policies and procedures, if it ever did happen, to make it more safer. So it's not always remembered, it always will be.
Having spent a career in aviation safety, I see what a difference that accident and the recommendations that flowed from it have made. Everything from aircraft design through to the training that we give to crew, the instructions we give to passengers and so on. So whilst I wish that accident had never happened, if there is one small glimmer of positivity to come from it, it's the difference it has made. The many passengers around the world that have survived accidents and incidents because of what we learned from that accident.
I'm hugely proud of the way my mum, my dad, William, Linda, the rest of SkySafe just came together to change the way aviation, particularly in the UK, was developed going forward. So we have an enormous legacy that we should be proud of. But it can't stop because there were recommendations that still haven't been implemented.
It was a terrible, terrible loss of life. The lessons have not been fully learned.
We've got to just keep making sure that we don't go, let's stick another row in, yeah, let's get the profitability up. Don't worry about the gap between the overwing exit or the bulkhead. All of those things just need to make sure that they're at the front of your mind, not the back of your mind.
Yes, we've done a job, but that doesn't mean to say that we can call it a day. We know full well that there ought to be a review of what we would say time and space, and that's evacuation, escaping, movement, space, etc., and the layout. We haven't finished our job yet. We've probably got to carry on doing things to make sure that we can improve safety.
I think we will always have to work hard to keep aviation safe, because in 40 years, lots of people have come into an industry that's become much safer. And what we mustn't do is forget what happened on that day. We can't lose sight of the terrible lessons that were learned with people's lives.
People did die at Manchester. People have had to live with the consequences of not seeing their loved ones for 40 years. Undoubtedly, SkySafe has a great legacy, but it can't stop. There's always more to do.
They call Manchester the forgotten disaster, which is so sad because it should never be forgotten about. That was a disaster of 55 people that died that day should never have happened. Manchester should never be forgotten about. All those people that lost their lives that day, they should never, ever be forgotten about.
At midday on the 22nd of August, the airfield, runways and taxiways fall silent for 1 minute, and they will do so again today.
Brenda Allmark, Morris Allmark, Stephen Allmark.
John Barker, Linda Barker, Lisa Barker,
Rebecca Bates,
Raymond Beale, Susan Beale, Vera Beale,
Sarah Beckett,
Barry Bennett, Mavis Bennett, Sally Bennett, Thomas Bennett,
David Bennison,
Anne Brannigan and Christopher Brannigan,
Anne-Marie Brueggemann,
Connie Buxton,
Philip Kirbishley,
Elaine Dumbell.
Every day, for 40 years I've thought about it. There isn't a day goes past that I don't think about them and say I'm sorry that I couldn't help them, because I would have done anything I could to get people out of that plane.
Merrill Edwards,
Barbara Elliott,
Sharon Ford,
Paul Forrester.
I feel extremely lucky to be a survivor when so many people died on the day. But at the same time, there is a certain amount of guilt attached.
So I now sit by the window, because that's, I suppose, my responsibility. If the same was to happen, I would do what my mum did for us.
Carol Hardy,
John Hughes.
Well, you can't forget those people that have died. Dave's death will be with me till I die. That loss is still there. That chair will always be empty.
Alison Jones,
Yvonne Lane,
Joanne Lawrence, Rita Lawrence,
Anne Lee.
She was such a wonderful person, and I mean, even after 40 years, you know, you begin to realise how big a part she played within the family. She was phenomenal, and she was great company, great fun. I desperately miss her.